In a new generation prison, inmates live as if they were free, except that they are subject to human experiments. Scientists aim to find a substance that will make the world a perfect place. However, what can you do if you have to sacrifice everything you love in order to make such a change?
Watch fantastic recaps by fans of the movies.
The movie begins in a room with mirrored glass. A man named Ray is sitting in a chair. On the other side of the glass, scientist Steve Abnesti explains that Ray is a volunteer at Spiderhead Prison, where experiments are being conducted on the effects of different substances on humans. He asks the subject for permission to inject him with a drug G46, and Ray agrees. Steve performs manipulations on his cell phone, and the man receives the administered dose. The scientist shares humorous anecdotes eliciting laughter from the subject. Then Steve's assistant Mark Verlaine tells Ray the usual facts. However, the man finds himself unable to suppress his laughter. The scientists conclude that their drug is working. The next day, Steve arrives at Spiderhead Prison on a remote island. He uses his smartphone to get through the front door. An inmate named Jeff is awakened by Steve's voice being heard over the loudspeaker. A scientist invites him to test drugs. Blindfolded, the man is escorted by boat to the experimental site. Steve suggests that Jeff take the drug N40, to which he agrees. After removing the blindfold, the subject is struck by the beauty of the surrounding world, which becomes incredibly bright under the influence of the substance. Afterwards, Jeff talks to another inmate, Lizzie, and tells her about his day. He says that everything he saw, flowers, mountains, or factory pipes, seemed incredibly beautiful and evoked feelings of love. In the evening in his room, Jeff recalls that he went to prison after relaxing at a party with his friends and girlfriend. In a state of inebriation, he opted for a car drive with a companion, resulting in a crush into a tree. As he falls asleep, he notices a device on his back to inject drugs into his body. The following day, scientists continue to test the drug N40 in the experimentation room, involving Jeff and an inmate named Heather. Their relationship initially lacks romantic feelings, but when the drug is administered, they do not hold back and become intimate despite being observed. After Jeff and Heather confess their love for each other, the scientists express elation at the outcomes, prompting Steve to task Mark with monitoring the duration of the love-induced effects. Abnesti explains that lovers involuntarily copy each other, repeating the same phrases, scratching at the same time, and so on. In his free time, Jeff continues to communicate with Lizzie, but does not tell her about what happened. The next day, the scientists repeat the experiment again. This time, instead of Heather, they choose Sarah, an older woman whom Jeff looks at with a degree of disgust. But as soon as they receive a double dose of N40, their minds again turn off all restrictions. In the evening, Mark reconfigures the device on Jeff's back, updating the capsules with the substances used in the device. The scientist warns the man not to touch other people's devices and not to let him touch his own. An unregulated dose of any substance can result in irreversible consequences. In the next experiment, Steve brings Jeff into the room across the hall where Heather and Sarah are kept. From here, he also sees another room where a man named Dave is greedily pouncing on food, feeling constantly hungry. The scientists instruct Jeff to disregard Dave and assign him a new task. His mission is to designate which of his previous associates will receive an injection of Darkenfloxax. Recalling the fear and anguish associated with the substance, Jeff declines to inflict harm on anyone. Eventually, the women are released and the experiment is cancelled. He spends the evening again in the company of Lizzie, for whom he arranges a surprise Christmas greeting. The next day, Jeff finds himself back in the chair of the experiment room. Rogan enters, a prisoner of enormous size, covered with tattoos. Jeff recalls his previous experiments with girls and is horrified. He asks the scientist to abandon the experiment. But Steve says that there will be no romance today and soon they are released. Jeff comes to the realization that one of his former partners must now decide who among the two will receive the Darkenflox injection. Furious, he turns to Steve, where Heather confirms his suspicions. Steve points out that the rules are set by a committee and reminds him that despite the privileges, a test subject can return to a regular prison at any time. Jeff regrets breaking the rules and apologizes. In the evenings, Steve also uses a device like his test subjects to inject himself with N40 and experience a rush of positive emotions. Before the next experiment, Steve asks Mark to change the capsules in the device for him. Jeff arrives early this time and sees it. Well, Steve informs him that the committee insists on a repeat of the experiment. The people at the top have ordered that one of his partners be injected with Darkenflox and track Jeff's reaction. The man again does not want to participate in such an experiment. Steve explains that everyone who is here did not go to prison by accident. They are hardened criminals, but Jeff is not convinced and asks the scientist to call the committee and ask them to cancel the experiment. Steve agrees and leaves the room. Instead of making the call, the scientist goes to the kitchen, where he chats with Lizzie. Back in the room, he claims that the committee has threatened to remove Jeff from the program and return him to prison if he refuses. Eventually, the man gives his consent and a darkened flux feed is activated in Heather's device. The girl succumbs to panic and fear, triggering the scientists to document Jeff's comments as he narrates the happenings in the other room. Heather begins thrashing around the room in terror and asking for help. The scientists conclude that Jeff's words have nothing to do with romance. The experiment is almost complete, but at that moment the girl hits her back against the wall and damages the device, which begins to uncontrollably supply substances into her body. Heather goes into an uncontrolled state, breaks a vase and cuts her neck with a shard. Mark and Steve rush to the girl's aid, and the project manager tentatively locks his notebook in the desk, but in his haste drops his keys on the floor. Jeff seizes the opportunity to peruse Steve's notes. Among the contents, he discovers detailed data about the drugs, along with the revelation that the pharmaceutical company is owned by Steve Abnesti himself. The man notices that the scientist is no longer behind the glass. He takes the notes back, closes the desk drawer, and throws the keys back on the floor. The project manager picks up his belongings unsuspecting. After Heather's death, Steve warns Mark not to let anyone outside the prison know about the incident. Trials begin to be conducted with Lizzie as well. The girl's first experience is an encounter with Dark Flux. Following the procedure, she engages in a conversation with Jeff, voicing skepticism about Spiderhead's purported superiority over. Lizzie's frank words force Jeff to open up to the girl as well. He reveals that not only was his friend in the car with him during the car accident, but also his girlfriend, who died that evening. Lizzie embraces Jeff. They kiss and spend the night together. A romantic relationship develops between them. One evening, Lizzie and Jeff are relaxing in the kitchen when Steve walks in. The scientist takes the groceries he needs and leaves, wishing them a pleasant evening. The couple in one voice wishes him the same. The scientist then realizes that a love affair has developed between his charges and that this can be used for an experiment. Later, Steve says that the committee required Jeff to administer Dark Flux to someone with whom he did not take N40. The man sees Lizzie in the room. Jeff adamantly refuses the idea. In response, the scientist suggests postponing the experiment. As Jeff starts to exit the office, Steve directs his assistant to double Jeff's dose. In the evening, Mark arrives to reconfigure Jeff's device, and the man inquires about the red bubble. The scientist claims it is a placebo, but Jeff does not believe him. He admits that he knows that Steve owns the company and there is no committee. He also believes that the firm is not interested in the love drug N40, and the main study is to help improve the red substance B6. Steve and Jeff return to the experiment. Absent from the office is Mark, who is resting due to illness. Lizzie agrees to the drug, but Jeff refuses, causing Steve to become angry. He demands that the girl tell him why she is in prison. Lizzie confesses to the heartbreaking act of leaving her baby in a car for 3 hours during the summer, resulting in the child's death from heat exposure. The pain of realizing what happened to her daughter remains an indelible agony for Lizzie. Steve watches as Jeff operates the phone, increasing the dose of the substance. Suddenly, the scientist himself feels fear and panic, realizing that Mark has replaced his drug with Dark Flux, spiking it instead of injecting it into Jeff's system. Threatened by the police, Mark and Jeff head to the research center. While Steve is being tormented by Dark Flux, Jeff unveils that he has unraveled the truth. The scientist didn't want to study the emotions of joy or happiness. The main drug B6 subjugates people, forcing them to do whatever they're told to do. Jeff removes the fear drug and feeds the scientist's device a substance that subdues his will. Under it, Steve answers all the questions he has asked. And Steve admits that their goal was to get the man to completely obey all orders. They wanted to test whether Jeff would act contrary to his feelings. The scientist justifies his act by the fact that if the experiment succeeded, it would be possible to make people work for the good of society. However, the scientist believes that it doesn't matter now because the B6 doesn't work. Jeff didn't inject it into his beloved. The prisoner demands to tell the world what happened to Heather, but Steve refuses so as not to lose the company. The scientist laughs, and when asked by the man what caused this reaction, informs him that Jeff was released 7 months ago and Lizzie's appeal was granted a week ago. Enraged, Jeff assaults the scientist, compelling him to unlock the main entrance using his smartphone. Jeff is about to leave the office, but Steve grabs a knife. Ordered to hand over the weapon, the scientist disobeys because it will ruin him and the company. Steve attacks Jeff, seizes his cell phone, and administers Lizzie the maximum dose of Darkenflox, inducing intense emotional distress in the girl. The scientist smashes the phone so no one can undo the action. Jeff lunges at his opponent and slams him against the wall, damaging his device in the process. They continue to fight hand to hand. Lizzie strangles herself with belt and falls senseless. Jeff sees this and crushes Steve with a few punches. The man grabs a knife and runs to Lizzie's aid. He removes her belt, opens the device, and throws away the drug capsules. The pair manage to escape the lab, but Steve warns over the loudspeaker that their escape will make conditions worse for the others. The criminals begin a manhunt for them to prevent their escape. En route, the fugitives cross paths with Sarah, whom Lizzie incapacitates. However, at that very moment, Ray catches up to them and begins assaulting the man. Steve at this time collects the remaining drugs to escape with them before the police arrive. Together, Lizzie and Jeff defeat Ray, but they are chased by the other prisoners and the pair escape into the corridors of Spiderhead. Steve successfully makes it to the airplane and attempts to start it. The escapee's path is blocked by Dave, but Lizzie bribes him with the keys to a pantry with a large supply of food. The pair hide behind the massive doors of one of the corridors. Jeff and Lizzie appear on the pier as Steve starts the airplane and takes off. But during the flight, the drugs from the damaged device are injected into him, so the scientist begins to experience their effects, with N40 coursing through his bloodstream. Steve becomes entranced by a small rocky island and directs the plane towards it, ultimately crashing onto the rocks. Police squads rush towards Spiderhead in speedboats. The prisoners manage to break down the door, yet Jeff and Lizzie find sanctuary in a boat at the pier, evading the pursuing police and leaving them in the dark, experiencing a surge of joy and happiness. The fugitives can't help but regret that scientists still haven't created a drug to soothe their conscience.
Watch fantastic recaps by fans of the movies.
In your opinion, what would the development of such substances lead to in reality? We strive diligently to offer engaging recaps. Feel free to share your thoughts and movie impressions in the comments.